Washington Journal continues.
Well, our guest now is Congressman Alan Grayson, Democrat from Florida, who's a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Get your take, especially as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, on a bit of news this morning from the AP. It's from Russia, and it says that Edward Snowden has been granted a one-year temporary asylum in Russia. This according to the lawyer, and this according to Russian news agency reports. Any reaction?
It's irrelevant. There ought to be a debate today in America about whether the government, specifically the Department of Defense and the NSA, should be receiving a record of every one of our phone calls. That's what we ought to be talking about, not about the leaker, but about the leak.
Headline in the New York Times, Senate panel presses NSA on phone logs. So a big hearing that we covered yesterday at Judiciary. New details on web monitoring abroad. Want to get your take on a piece of tape from the committee. It's Senator Chuck Grassley talking to Deputy Attorney General James Cole about gathering what kind of specific information. We'll take a look and then we can talk, okay?
Okay.
What information does the government collect under this program? And specifically, is anyone's name, address, social security number, or location collected?
Senator Grassley, first to answer the second part, name, address, location, social security number is not collected under the 215 program at all.
Okay.
Never has been, never will be. Secondly, the nature of the collection is really very dependent on this reasonable articulable suspicion. While a lot of metadata does exist in a database, it cannot be accessed unless you go through the procedures of documenting that there's reasonable articulable suspicion that the phone number you want to ask about is associated with terrorists.
Congressman, reaction?
It's irrelevant. It's misleading as well. Listen, every time you make a phone call, every time I make a phone call, every time your listeners call into the show to make a phone call, the NSA gets a record of that call. That's what people are concerned about.
What's the answer?
The answer is to stop it. It's unnecessary and it's a violation of the U.S. Constitution.
Our guest will be with us for about 40 minutes. He is Congressman Alan Grayson, member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. It's his first visit to Washington Journal, Democrat from Florida. It's the 9th District. Where is the 9th District located?
South Orlando.
South Orlando. So you may remember he previously served earlier in the 8th District. This was from 2009 to 2011. Defeated for re-election and then came back and won in this other district.
The biggest comeback in the history of the U.S. House of Representatives, according to the House historian.
Really? Tell us
That's
more
right.
about that experience and what it's like to be back in.
Well, I was in a district that had been Republican for 34 years, was elected by 4 points in 2008, defeated by 18 points in the great Republican Tea Party wave of 2010 when 63 Democrats lost their seats, then came back only 2 years later and won by 25 points. That swing, 43-point swing, is the biggest in the history of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Phone numbers on the bottom of the screen for our guests. We'll get right to your calls in a moment, but we do want to ask you, of course, about the FISA court. Explain what the FISA court is and what kind of changes you would like to see.
FISA court is a secret star tribunal that's been set up in order to pretend to provide some oversight to the NSA regarding the NSA's domestic surveillance, which itself is largely illegal and still being conducted regardless. The FISA court rubber stamps requests from the NSA, the Defense Department, to conduct domestic surveillance. In one recent year, they had roughly 1,000 requests, and they allowed every single one of them. It's a court that's been appointed entirely by our right-wing Chief Justice, and virtually all of the people who serve on that court are people who were appointed by George W. Bush to the courts.
So tell us about changes you'd like to make and what do you think is realistic, if anything?
Well, the system certainly isn't working. When you have a court that simply uses a rubber stamp and allows for every single request that comes before it, there's no genuine oversight that's being conducted. But I think that the deeper problem here is that the wrong judgments are being made concerning what's relevant. The statute is clear that in order to collect any information under any circumstances domestically, that information has to be relevant to the investigation of terrorism by a foreign person. That's why we have the Defense Department, to protect us from actions by foreigners, not actions by Americans. There's been a fine, clear line drawn since the 1870s in the Posse Comitatus Act. The Defense Department is supposed to defend us against foreign enemies. The CIA has similar responsibilities. Domestically, we rely upon the FBI and we rely upon the Department of Justice. Notwithstanding that, for the past few years, the NSA has gone wild and conducted domestic surveillance on literally every single American, all 320 million people who have a telephone. And that's wrong. It's unconstitutional. Our founding fathers were quite clear on this point, and the NSA has made a mockery of that.
First call for our guest, who has a law degree from Harvard, 1983, has worked as an attorney, is now a member of the U.S. House. Again, Alan Grayson, Democrat from Florida. Marie from San Antonio, Texas, you're up first on the Democrats line. Hi.
Grayson, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm a lady down in Texas that you took the time to make a phone call to here a few years ago and thank me on your health care comment. But I followed you, and we really appreciate what you do. I'm down here on the southern border, and I'm very, very concerned about the drones and all the domestic surveillance down here. I don't think people have any idea how widespread it is, and that has concerned me when I saw a story here a few years ago about the war blimps that they were using. Everything we're taking out of the Middle East, the military-industrial complex, is bringing here. And I worry about that, and I think that the drone program in particular is something that really, really needs to be investigated and put a halt to.
Drone program.
Well, in fact, I've taken a step to do that. I passed an amendment, and by the way, it's difficult for any Democrat to pass an amendment in the Republican-controlled House, but nevertheless, I passed an amendment just a few weeks ago to forbid the Department of Homeland Security from acquiring any weaponized drones. What's happening now is that there's a second generation of drones coming out. The Department of Defense is treating its initial drones as surplus, and they wanted to recycle them in a way that would allow them to be used against Americans. That's absurd. So we incorporated in the Department of Homeland Security appropriations bill, an amendment, the Grayson Amendment, that would prohibit the use of weaponized drones by the Department of Homeland Security. I think we have to get our priorities straight here. There's not been any doubt about this since the 1870s. The Department of Defense is supposed to direct its efforts beyond our borders, not within our borders. That's a very clear line that has to be maintained. And thank you very much for your encouragement. I do remember the call.
We have Darius from Prince Anne, Maryland on the line for Independence. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine.
I was calling because I wanted to know, I'm in the military, also a student. When we're deployed, is the NSA, are they watching our phone calls? Are they monitoring our communications with our family members back home? And I wanted to know, how much does it cost to investigate or to have a rubber stamp for the green light to go ahead and hey, let's monitor this person or that person? We are in a recession, and it seems that we're spending so much money on monitoring and all these different things. We could be investing money elsewhere.
Thanks.
Yes, there was a shocking and documented report several years ago that the NSA was actually listening to phone calls of a very personal nature between deployed servicemen overseas and their wives, phone sex, actually. And that NSA agents were literally passing around tapes of phone sex calls that had been made by servicemen to their wives. Apparently, none of the NSA agents who were conducting that so-called investigation were ever punished. And that's an illustration of the kind of abuse that you can expect to arise in a program that watches everyone all the time, just like Big Brother. It does cost a lot of money. Unfortunately, very few members of Congress know how much it costs, because that's part of the so-called black budget, the part of the budget that's kept secret even from members of Congress. It's safe to say, though, that it costs billions upon billions of dollars for us to be watching us, an activity that the Constitution forbids because there's no probable cause and no particularity, and it needs to stop.
There was something on the House floor last week known as the Amash Amendment involved in all of this. NSA, all these NSA issues that are out there. Remind us what that amendment was, how you voted on it, and what it all means.
Yes, the Amos-Conyers Amendment was a bipartisan effort to rein in the NSA and to stop domestic surveillance that's in violation of the Constitution. I voted for it. I lobbied my colleagues very heavily for it. I was responsible for the drafting of a letter, a Dear Colleague letter, that I personally circulated to literally a couple of hundred of my colleagues on the floor of the House to make the argument in favor of respecting the Constitution and respecting the rights of Americans to their own privacy. The amendment just barely failed. I think we'll see it again. I'm sure we'll see something like it again. It simply would have inserted an order into each FISA order, a single sentence into each FISA order that the court issues, reminding people that domestic surveillance is unconstitutional without probable cause.
There's a tweet here following up on something you said earlier, Congressman Grayson. Is there any evidence that the Chief Justice avoided selecting Democratic-appointed judges for the FISA court?
Well, listen, the evidence is in who he selected. There are roughly as many democratically appointed judges as there are judges appointed by George W. Bush and other Republicans in the federal judiciary, and he has singled out the George W. Bush appointees and the other Republican appointees as the sole members of the court.
Next call, Linda, East Point, Michigan, Republican, for Alan Grayson, the congressman. Hi there.
Hi. Yes, I'm just curious. What was the NSA gathering up all of our personal records, and what the IRS has been doing? I guess for our protection. Why is it then, when Americans truly needed help in Benghazi, the administration sat there and did nothing?
Well, those things are not at all commensurate, but let me try to address that. In fact, it is tragic and unconstitutional and not in any way necessary to keep us safe for our Defense Department to be spying on us. Just think about it in terms of common sense. When you call your pizzeria and order a deep dish pizza with mushrooms and pepperoni on top, does the Defense Department really need to know about that? Does that make you safer in any respect whatsoever? I think the answer is obvious. It doesn't. Now, with regard to Benghazi, I've had the benefit of reading all the classified material, including the cables. The ambassador took a very brave, but in the end, unfortunate chance when he went to an area that was not protected in the way that embassies are normally protected. He clearly knew what he was doing. He had been posted in Benghazi for many months at the beginning of the rebellion against the dictator, Gaddafi. He took a chance. He took a chance for the benefit of furthering U.S. foreign policy aims. He didn't expect that he'd be seeing an attack by roughly 50 armed men, and we all know the result. The idea that anybody could have rescued him is really far-fetched. There's no evidence of that in any of the classified information. It's an unfortunate incident. It happens. We have servicemen who are serving in the military who die, unfortunately, almost every day. And that's what the price that we have to pay sometimes for our freedom. Travis,
Burlington, Vermont, Democrat. Good morning.
Good morning. Congressman Grayson, I can appreciate if on a personal level it somehow bothers you that every time you make a phone call, the number from which you're calling and the number to which you're calling is being stored somewhere. But the claim that a program that they've already documented has prevented 50 possible terrorist attacks is irrelevant seems like a bit of a stretch.
Well, actually, what your question is a bit of a stretch. Nobody is claiming that it's prevented 50 possible terrorist attacks. What the NSA has done is it's sort of trumped up the claim that it has somehow disrupted roughly 40-plus attacks, almost all of which were going to take place abroad. Nobody, even members of Congress, know what they mean by disrupted. Nobody really knows. As Congressman Amash pointed out, the only documented claim that this program had anything to do with interfering in any way with anything involving terrorism is a single case where a cab driver was making contributions to a mosque, and the government claimed that those contributions later on ended up financing terrorism. And as a result of that, they claim that they can spy on every American and record every phone call. Listen, if they had more than that, you can be sure that we'd know about it, and they don't. And in those cases that you're talking about, all they're saying is that sometime during the course of the investigation, some of this unconstitutional data was consulted. They're not saying that it prevented the terrorist attacks at all. They're not saying that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to disrupt them with the information that they had. And that's exactly what's wrong with this. What's exactly wrong with this is that the so-called intelligence community is making these rabid, hysterical claims that in order to keep us safe, we have to spy on ourselves. And there are some people who find that convincing. I think it defies common sense. I don't buy it at all.
We have about 25 minutes left with our guest, Congressman Alan Grayson, Democrat from Florida. Lots more of your calls, but here is a tweet for the congressman. Do you think the GOP has a secret plan to rule the world? What is it, and when do they have their meetings?
You know, honestly, I think I've been asked whether the Democrats have a secret plan to rule the world. And all I can say is that if we do, it's so secret that even I don't know about it, and I'm a member of Congress.
Antoine from Fair Lawn, New Jersey, independent caller. Thank you for waiting. Antoine, you there?
Thank you for the program.
Go ahead.
And welcome, Mr. Grayson. I'm a true independent, a leaning Republican. My beef with the Republicans is the militarism and the national security. Since 2008, FISA court offered 30,000 dispensations to FBI to investigate the phone calls, which means that 30,000 minus 50 that they allegedly discovered, this is that many people were called to FBI, their neighbors, their relatives interviewed, all their private records were turned down, and they found nothing. However, if 6 months or 7 months down the road, they Google their own name, I bet they're going to find investigated for possible connection to terrorism. So I really think that the effort should be extended in order to control the program. I don't think we need this program at all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any reaction?
Well, I don't think we should wait until we see massive, widespread violations of a very personal nature regarding people's privacy rights before we put an end to an unconstitutional program. The effects can be debated, but the validity of this program really can't be debated. The Constitution says in the Fourth Amendment that we'll be secure in our papers and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures without probable cause, and that all warrants that are issued shall be issued with particularity. It's ridiculous to pretend that there is probable cause to get the phone records of every American. It's absurd to pretend that there's any particularity in order that says give us all your phone records to every major telephone company in the entire country. It's just wrong. It's wrong whatever the consequences, and it needs to end.
Here's a headline from The Hill. Congressman Obama, the president, they write, and lawmakers are going to huddle today on the NSA. He'll meet with a bipartisan group of lawmakers at the White House today to, quote, discuss key programs under FISA. This group includes Senators Wyden and Udall, who have been outspoken critics of the recently revealed NSA surveillance programs, along with Dianne Feinstein, the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and ranking member Saxby Chambliss. Other names: Dick Durbin will be there, Congressman Mike Rogers, who chairs House Intelligence, among others. What do you make of this kind of gathering, and what, if anything, might come out of it? Why is it happening?
There have been constant gatherings like this by apologists for the program, and they all repeat the same 5 talking points again and again. What's been missing is input from the critics of the program. And in order to fill that gap, we scheduled a hearing this week, a bipartisan hearing that would have been attended by both Democrats and Republicans, to invite both left and right-wing critics of the programs, everyone from the Cato Institute on the right to the American Civil Liberties Union on the left, plus Glenn Greenwald, who probably knows more about this than anyone else in the world at this point, other than the people who actually run these programs. We invited them in for a hearing. Unfortunately, the president decided to come to Capitol Hill for only the second time this entire year at the exact same time as the time that we had scheduled for this hearing, and therefore we had to postpone it. We don't need more meetings and more hearings from the apologists of the program. What we need to do is to hear both sides of the story, and that let Congress and the American people decide.
Jim, Gatesville, Texas, Republican. Good morning. Jim, you there?
Hello?
Hi, Jim.
Yes. I'm curious, can you tell me why the Department of Homeland Security needs 3,700 armored vehicles within the United States. Who are they going to use those vehicles against inside the United States? And what they need 1.6 billion rounds of ammunition for, some of those rounds being .308 sniper rounds with sniper rifles that they bought.
I am an opponent of the militarization of the Department of Homeland Security. As I indicated earlier, I passed the Grayson Amendment, which actually prohibits the Department of Homeland Security from acquiring weaponized drones. I think in general, we have no difficulty in dealing with the threats that occur within our borders when we have proper information about them. And for instance, we have the police to deal with that. We have the FBI to deal with that. We have the Department of Justice to deal with that. I don't believe that the U.S. Department of Defense or similarly capable forces employing military-type weapons are necessary within our borders to be used against us. So I agree with you.
You've mentioned your amendments a couple of times, and if you ever check out Slate magazine, you'll see this recent piece, why Alan Grayson is the most effective member of the House. Alan Grayson is running 40 minutes late, but his reason is sound. It's 11:30 in the morning. The House Science Committee started marking up NASA's funding bill, adding and subtracting whatever they could. At 5 p.m., the committee was still at it. When the members finished a half hour later, the only headline they generate would be about the killing of a program to send a robotic mission to a small asteroid by 2016. Grayson once again had walked under the radar, they write. The Democratic congressman from Orlando had convinced the Republican-run committee to adopt 5 of his amendments. One would bar the federal government from awarding contracts to corporations convicted of fraud, and another would force NASA to consider American public-private partnership human spaceflight before it partnered with foreign space programs. Each was getting him closer to an unheralded title, the congressman who's passed more amendments than any of his 434 peers. Tell us more. How have you become, in their eyes, the most effective member of the House?
Well, it's less and less unheralded as time goes on, I have to say, and I appreciate that because although we do the work for the sake of the work, it is nice to get the recognition that I think that we've earned. It is in fact true that we've passed more amendments this year than any other member of the House. We've passed 13 on the floor of the House already. We've passed 31 in our committees and subcommittees. On one of my 2 committees, I've passed half of all the amendments that have been passed, even though the committee has 40 members. On the other, I've passed a third of all the amendments that have been passed. That committee has 45 members. And in general, what we do is we attack the bills as they're released to us, sometimes with only barely 24 hours notice, and we try to figure out what we can do to make them better for America, for the common good. And a lot of times we're able to accomplish that. I'm a Democrat. In any contested vote that's along party lines, I'm not going to do too well. But the fact is that consistently we come up with ways to produce amendments that appeal to both Democrats and Republicans, and sometimes not for the same reasons. And I was doing that during my first term as well. I think the only bipartisan accomplishment of the 111th Congress, a very contentious and partisan Congress, the only bipartisan accomplishment was our bill being my bill and Ron Paul's bill, to audit the Federal Reserve, the first independent audit of the Federal Reserve in a century. And we were able to accomplish that because Ron Paul lined up the Republicans, I lined up the Democrats. That's a recipe for success. That was simply a good government bill that deserved to be passed. Now we're doing that not just once, but over and over and over again in the 113th Congress, and I feel proud of that.
We had Brian on the line from Greensboro, North Carolina, Democratic caller for Congressman Grayson. Hi there.
Hello. How's it going today?
Fine.
Congressman Grayson, since you're fully aware that government institutions don't always give the full story when it comes to important issues, why aren't you standing by the nearly 2,000 building experts demanding a new investigation of Building 7? There's overwhelming evidence that explosives were used to bring it down.
Now that bin Laden is dead, and now that 9/11 is a decade behind us and more, I think that a good argument can be made that the documents that the federal government has regarding the 9/11 attack should be declassified, and then the truth will come out.
Boring file clerk asks the congressman via Twitter, what's your opinion of the Bradley Manning verdict and of WikiLeaks in general?
Well, you have to distinguish between those two things. Bradley Manning did leak an awful lot of classified information, evidently to WikiLeaks. I think the court was correct in deciding that he was not guilty of aiding the enemy because he hadn't directed any of that information to the enemy. and that's what the statute says. That's how the military justice rules read. But with regard to the rest of it, I think it's clear that he did, in fact, leak confidential information that was classified, and therefore he got punished. Many people who do brave things sometimes get punished for them. I think back to the civil rights era and how Congressman John Lewis was punished over and over and over again for acts of courage. We need leakers in this country because, unfortunately, the security intelligence community and the military defense complex, the military-industrial complex, have created a system where we have 1 million people who receive classified information and 320 million who don't. An enormous, staggering amount of information is generated by the government and wrongly classified as classified. And in a system like that, we can see everything from secret wars against Cambodia all the way up to unconstitutional surveillance of every single American in their phone calls that the American public needs to know. So sometimes a Snowden has to step forward and let us know about the things that our government is keeping from us. With regard to WikiLeaks, I think WikiLeaks has occasionally brought to light unconstitutional actions and unethical actions and illegal actions by various government officials, sometimes domestic, sometimes foreign. And I think that is a useful purpose.
Jim, Loves Park, Illinois, independent. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. And I want to say right off the bat that Representative Grayson, you are truly a patriot, and our republic is better for it.
Thank you.
The long and short of this is, for me, as a former signals intelligence analyst in the U.S. Army working for the same agency you're talking about, I am deeply concerned with using U.S. forces against U.S. persons. And I'm actually shocked. This has been going on for a long time. I made the joke online that, back in the 1980s, we fought a war against the USSR, and now we're fighting the war against the USERs. But it's very true. And you can go back to 1992 and 93 when Bill Clinton changed how we use posse comitatus against U.S. persons and cigarette bullets entering the country with drugs, or even changes to the United States Signals Intelligence Directive 18 as declassified and shown under cryptonome.org, that we have slowly slipped down this path. And I really commend you, and I commend Senator Rand Paul for standing up for the Constitution. And please carry on.
Well, thank you. It's very important to me to make sure that we don't see the militarization of American life. In fact, that is exactly what Osama bin Laden was trying to bring about. He didn't believe that he could destroy enough tall buildings in America in order to do any real damage. What he thought was that we'd turn on each other. And I'm doing my best to prevent that.
As a member of Foreign Affairs, I wanted to get your reaction to something the House passed yesterday. The New York Times has this headline, sending a message to Iran. The House is approving tougher sanctions, an overwhelming vote that would impose the toughest sanctions yet on Iran, calling the measure a critical step to cripple the country's disputed nuclear program, and brushing aside calls for restraint by critics who said the Iranian president-elect should first be given a chance to negotiate. They say the vote was 400 to 20. How'd you vote, and what do you think about Iran these days?
Oh, I voted in favor of it. In fact, I introduced 5 amendments to that specific bill in order to strengthen it, but honestly, I don't think it's enough. I'm not one of those people who thinks we should water these things down. I think that we should strengthen them even more than the bill that we actually passed, because what we're doing is not working. Iran is proceeding with getting a nuclear weapon. I don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. There is this theory that, well, if Pakistan has one and India has one, why can't Iran have one? And that's just not an experiment I want to ever run. I don't think that every country deserves nuclear weapons. I don't believe that at all. I think it's a question of, are we willing to take the risk? There was a great debate about whether we should have allowed the Soviet Union to get nuclear weapons when we had nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union did not. The same debate occurred after China got a nuclear weapon. I think that in the case of Iran, given their public statements, they want to destroy Israel, they hate America, I don't know why we should take the chance. In that light, I am pleased that we have cut back substantially on Iraq's oil income, but I don't see any direct evidence that pain that we are inflicting on the Iranian economy, which is real and substantial, is having any impact on the decision-making of the people in charge with regard to their nuclear program.
How about thoughts on the situation in Syria?
It's tragic. There is no obvious right answer. I tend to have more trust for the opposition in Syria than I do for the current government. I understand that there are many people who have reservations about part of the opposition. Obviously, if we help them, we're likely to influence them and influence the outcome than if we don't help them. But in general, I'm hesitant to do that sort of thing because, frankly, I'm not sure that there are any real U.S. interests involved. I feel pain for the people in Syria who have suffered. More people died in the Syrian civil war last year than any other armed conflict in the world, except possibly the Mexican drug war. It was close. Many, many people died in both locations. But despite that suffering, we are not the world's policemen, and we have to be cautious when we get involved.
Back to Iran, there's a tweet. Would you like to put U.S. boots on the ground in Iran to stop them from getting a weapon?
No.
Gainesville, Florida, Republican caller named Paul. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. And first of all, Alan Grayson, I'd like to congratulate you on your fine work for the United States of America. The fact that posse comitatus and habeas corpus have all been wiped out, the First, Second, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments to the Constitution are gone, the fact that the NDAA laws have been accepted. Do not Congress and the Senate, our military, police, and all the other police organizations in the United States, don't they realize that the freedoms that they take away from us with what's going on with these billion calls a day and the NSA working us over, don't they realize that those same freedoms they take from us, they also take from you guys? They take from all the infrastructure of our government. Everybody's being monitored. This is a blanket situation. I'm ashamed of it. And then you correlate that with what's going on in business, the fact that Wall Street is being heavily manipulated by the banks and the corporations, and that the fact that we have trillions of dollars in national debt, along with the five major banks, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, with $289 trillion in debt load derivative positions. I mean, I look at all of this and I'm astounded that America is even surviving financially, let alone with our freedoms being drawn off. Your comments, sir.
Well, first, with regard to the NSA, although some of what you described is true, I am nowhere near as fatalistic as that. We do still live in a democracy. We have elections every 2 years. Take my word for it, I'm in them. And I think that we can make a difference. Americans need to stand up and fight. And, frankly, there have been just as many Republicans as there are Democrats who are standing up for our rights. Look at the vote on the Amash Amendment. It was close. I think that if Democrats who love freedom hold Democrats who voted against the Amash-Conyers Amendment accountable in the next election, if Republicans who love freedom hold Republicans who voted against the Amash-Conyers Amendment accountable in the next election, then I think we'll see real change. Because we can't destroy our freedoms in the name of saving them. I sometimes think back to the My Lai massacre, and I remember the soldier, the commander who said, we destroyed the village in order to save it. Well, we can't do the same thing with our democracy. The thing that makes America special, among other things, is our freedom, our constitutional rights. And we can't bargain those away with some kind of illusory feeling that in return we're getting security. As Ben Franklin said, those who would give up their freedom for a little bit of security deserve neither.
Tweet for you once again, Congressman. Don't hear this term as much as we used to, but do you consider yourself a blue dog Democrat?
No. I'm a progressive Democrat, but I respect the Constitution, and in fact, I took an oath of office to uphold it, something that I keep at the forefront of my mind. And I want to make sure that my colleagues do the same. We had a private meeting with the NSA recently, and in that meeting, one of us said, one of the members of the Democratic leadership said, I took an oath to protect Americans. That's not the oath. The oath is prescribed by the Constitution in the case of the President, and the oath is to uphold the Constitution of the United States. That's my oath. That's what I do all the time. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you take the same oath.
What are you expecting to hear next month as you meet back with constituents? You going to do some town halls?
We already have. We did a town hall meeting on raising the minimum wage this week. We explained to people that doesn't really make much sense that in Australia they have a $16 an hour minimum wage and they have 5% unemployment. Here in America we have a $7.25 minimum wage and we have 7.5% unemployment. Something has gone awry when people work 40 hours a week, sometimes 80 hours a week in 2 jobs, and they still end up under the poverty level and living in poverty. I think we need to do better by the people in this country who work. I have nothing against retirees. I hope to be one day. But as for the workforce, I think that there's many people in the workforce who work really hard, apply themselves, apply their talents, in some cases very well educated, and they have very little pay and no benefits. I think that if you work, you should have health coverage. And I think that if you work, you should be raised above the poverty level.
You'll be asked to take another vote on health care tomorrow before you go. Specifically, it's a bill by Congressman Tom Price. I think it has to do with the IRS enforcement of the health care law and withholding some of that money. What do you make of this issue and this legislation overall?
I think we're wasting an awful lot of time here. I think, honestly, the Republican leadership in Washington, D.C. has been flailing around desperately in a completely ineffective way. The fact that they used the force of their numbers to pass 39 different repeals of Obamacare and none of them would ever become law is indicative of the fact that they need to concentrate on more constructive things than that.
Sam, Rome, Georgia, Democrat for Congressman Grayson.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for taking my call. I've got a lot going on in my mind right now, but my biggest comment first is the American people need to understand, after the 9/11 attacks, how soon was the Patriot Act ready to be signed, sealed, and delivered? It really bothers me. And I guess my next comment is the Patriot Act is just not, I guess, a result of the Patriot Act with this snooping, I guess you might call it. And I'll listen to my answer over them.
Well, the interesting thing is that many of the people who supported the Patriot Act are literally appalled by pervasive domestic spying by the Department of Defense and the NSA on Americans. A good example of this is Jim Sensenbrenner, who could be called the father of the Patriot Act. He spoke out forcefully and eloquently during the debate on the Amash-Conyers Amendment a couple of weeks ago on exactly that point. He said that he wrote it, he knows what it means, he knows what was intended, and this is not it. And I think it's clear to any fair reading of the law that this is not it. As I mentioned earlier in the program, the law provides that the collection of any information regarding any American citizen on U.S. soil must be based upon relevance to a specific investigation of terrorism. And instead what they're doing is collecting all of our phone records and playing around with them. The boys are playing with their toys, and in this case the toys are our privacy.
We've touched on Iran and Syria and Libya. There's an Egypt question for you this morning via Twitter. Congressman Grayson, should Egypt uphold the law, or should Obama uphold the law and deny aid to Egypt until they allow elections following their coup, as he puts it?
Yes, the law is the law. It's the law of the land. We need to respect it, and I think that's something that sometimes lawmakers themselves need to be reminded of. We've passed any number of laws this year that I regarded elements of as unconstitutional. I feel like I'm sometimes waging a one-man war in Washington, D.C. against unconstitutional provisions. I don't think that the president has any choice. We have to show respect for the law. It was a coup. It is a coup. Under any reasonable definition of the word coup, that's what happened. The law is clear on that point. You can say that the law is unwise. You can say the law doesn't, in this particular case, serve American interests. But the law is the law. We must be a nation of laws, not a nation of people.
One last call for our guest. It's Mike from Laguna Woods, California. Independent caller. Hey, Mike.
Hey, good morning, gentlemen. Congressman, I'm a libertarian, but I respect all men and women of principle and conscience, and so I certainly respect you, sir.
Thank you.
James Madison wrote that no nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And it strikes me that Madison's principle connects the Bush-Obama neocon militarist policy abroad with the Bush-Obama police state agenda at home. So with respect to global war on terror, after a decade of war, hundreds of thousands of deaths, trillions of dollars, about $500 trillion a year according to antiwar.com, And despite the misuse of the greatest military in the history of the world against a ragtag gang of psychopaths, the global war on terror is not abating, it's expanding throughout Asia and Africa. Why do you think the Democratic politicians in Congress endorse the Bush-Cheney neocon agenda as long as President Obama implements it?
Congressman?
Well, in fact, the progressives among the Democrats in Congress have often found common ground with the libertarians. And honestly, I'm not sure why the libertarians are so often associated with the Republican Party. In other countries, libertarians are regarded as being on the left, not on the right. There's so much common ground with regard to our love of peace, with regard to our respect for civil liberties, with regard to our questioning of the current economic arrangements in this country, in terms of the government's involvement in the money supply and so on. And I think that it's sad. Everybody must recognize that it's sad that we are perpetually at war. That was the excuse in 1984 for the pervasive domestic surveillance that was depicted by George Orwell in that book. The fact that those countries were constantly at war gave an excuse for the leaders of those countries to engage in pervasive domestic surveillance. And the same thing could become true in America. I'm doing whatever I can to stop it. I have a 12-year-old son. He's actually my middle child. We have 5 children, and he's the third one. He literally can't remember any time when America was not at war. It's wrong.
Our guest has been Congressman Alan Grayson, Democrat from Florida, serving in his second term, non-consecutive terms, won 63% of the vote last time out in the 9th District in Florida. He's a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Thanks a lot for coming by.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. It's a great show. You uphold a very high standard and inform people. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. We'll take another short time out and then have our final segment. It's about a CNN film that's going to be debuting tonight. It's called Our Nixon. And they use reels of previously unseen home movies from Nixon's closest advisors, Richard Nixon's closest advisors. We'll talk with the producer of the film, but first, some more news now from C-SPAN Radio.
It's 9:16 a.m. Eastern Time. Well, jobless numbers in this hour show the number of Americans applying for unemployment benefits fell 19,000 last week to a seasonally adjusted 326,000. That's the fewest since January of 2008. The decline signaling more strength for the job market. The payroll company ADP says that companies created 200,000 jobs in July. That's the most for that survey since December. The report considered a hopeful sign ahead for Friday's Labor Department report on the July unemployment figures. Turning to the new health care law, Bloomberg reports that supporters and opponents of the Affordable Care Act have targeted mothers in new advertising campaigns as a major piece of the law is getting ready to roll out on October 1st. The $500 million worth of advertising focusing on women because they make up about 80% of the health care decisions for their families, and they also utilize more health care than men. Meanwhile, House Democratic Whip Steny Hoyer, in prepared remarks for a morning news conference, says, quote, House Republicans are wasting time on the 40th vote to repeal health care reform, close quote. Well, while Representative Hoyer is addressing the media, senior government officials will be testifying before the House Ways and Means Committee about implementing the health care law. Appearing will be IRS Acting Director Daniel Werfel and Gary Cohen, head of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. You can hear live coverage of the hearing at 10 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio or watch the hearing on C-SPAN 3. And those are some of the latest headlines on C-SPAN Radio.